Welcome into Courtside Seats with Kroeger, a Charlotte Hornets podcast. Here he is, Chris Kroeger.
All right, episode 12 of Courtside Seats, and we've been having fun going throughout the summer, and it's kind of crazy to think we are a few weeks away from training camp getting underway, and of course we'll have our first preseason game in just over a month, September 28th at the Dean Dome, and we'll officially kick off the James Borrego era of the Charlotte Hornets. And I don't know, I figured what a better time to maybe go outside and try to get some information on what we're doing here with the Hornets. And that Tony Parker fellow is kind of a big deal. He's going to be a big part of what this Hornets team tries to do to get back to the playoffs. And so we're going to welcome in Spurs beat writer from the San Antonio Express News, SpursNation.com. Kind enough to join us, Tom Orsborn. Thank you, Tom. It's good to talk to you, man. How you doing?
Hey, Chris, doing well. It's my pleasure.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about. It's weird kind of how, I think certain teams intrinsically get linked throughout history for whatever reason it is. And now, I don't know, I think with JB and Tony Parker coming over, and then unfortunately, we'll talk about in a little bit, the passing of Bob Bass last week. I think you start to look at all the ties that bind, and I don't know, Charlotte's kind of San Antonio West, it feels like these days.
Absolutely, yeah. We're excited to track, how James does out there. He was very well liked here in San Antonio. We probably have a little bit less dealings with the assistant coaches than a lot of franchises because of how the Spurs structure things as far as media availability goes. But the times that I did talk with James, it was always a pleasure. Just very professional and very accommodating and very friendly, and it's always a good face to see, no matter where you bumped into him.
It's kind of interesting too, because here we are, right? Like, we're full of optimism and hope, and it was so cool to. We met with our Swarm 365, our season ticket holders, last week, and we did a town hall event, and Mitch Kupchak was up there, and Fred Whitfield, our team president, and JB, and. You just get this is hope springs eternal, right? New basketball operation comes in here, and you got a new lease on life. And then I feel like everybody's looking at San Antonio right now, and they're thinking, what on earth is going on with the Spurs, right? Because it's like we're 2 full seasons removed from Timmy retiring.
Yeah.
You've been writing for the last few months, and specifically the last few weeks, about what's going on with Manu Ginobili, and does he return after 18 seasons? And obviously Tony is now left, which seems still so. I don't think people have truly will wrap their head around that until they see him in teal and purple coming up in a few months. And then obviously the Kawhi situation. So it's just it's so crazy. You just expect things to keep turning, I guess, in San Antonio. But man, this is different over the last couple of years.
You said it, Chris. I mean, very unspur-like. We've been used to that consistency and a tweak here and there to the roster, but the mainstay is always being there. And certainly losing Tony Parker is just huge. Kawhi, I mean, that it was just a guy that was labeled the face of the franchise by Greg Popovich a few years ago. I mean, it's going to be a sea change. And then as you mentioned, if Manu bows out, you've just got a whole new look to this roster, to this franchise. So much institutional knowledge and knowledge of the Spurs culture will be displaced in the big three finally all being gone. So. Yeah, we're kind of on pins and needles as far as Manu goes. Nobody wants to see him retire. Well, I take that back. There's a certain amount of fans that are saying, why hang on to these old guys? It's time to start anew. But there's a lot of people that would be. It would just really shake them up to lose Manu Ginobili.
Yeah, and that, by the way, I didn't even mention Danny Green and Kyle Anderson's going to Memphis too. So yeah, it's crazy. But like Rudy Gay and DeMar DeRozan, you've written about those two too, and the tie that binds those guys. They're such great friends. So I mean, I think San Antonio is going to be fine in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, it's different. And here's the other crazy thing is too. You get Lonnie Walker, and you've written a lot about Lonnie, and Lonnie's a really interesting kid coming out of Miami, the 18th overall pick, and this is the first time in 20, 21 years the Spurs have had a top 20 pick. So Yeah, it's kind of crazy what San Antonio's. I don't know. I bristle at some of this stuff, Tom, because people talk about tanking all the time, and
right.
I mean, I get it. You win the lottery with Timmy, and then you find Kawhi, who changes things too. But I don't know. I love watching what the Spurs do because, as JB calls it, he calls it a program. I think the Spurs are a program, and I think they're a testament to what you can do in a not large market in the NBA right now.
Right, exactly, and I think that's why he's a good fit for you guys. I saw that quote from him saying, I think our biggest room for growth, I believe he termed it as internal development. And I know exactly what he means. It's not only developing talent, player development, it's just developing a culture and a way of doing things along the lines of what the Spurs did. And, the Spurs, it's interesting because there was a debate going on this summer. A certain segment of the fans, were saying, let's just blow it up and start over, and that's the way to rebuild. But the Spurs, they don't do that. They really don't. They put such a priority on winning and keeping that winning culture going, and that's what you're going to see this year. Another big flashpoint this season was over Vegas, the Westgate Sportsbook placing them they're over and under for wins at 43.5, and a lot of fans took umbrage at that. And I talked to Rudy Gay last week at an event he had up in Baltimore, and he was just shaking his head, and I agree with it. I don't see them challenging the Rockets and the Warriors for supremacy in the West, but I certainly think as they're constructed now, I certainly think they'll win more than 43 games.
It's funny you talk about JB being a good fit from a coaching standpoint, and we'll talk about the late Bob Bass, former Spurs GM, coach. He did everything there, and also former Hornets GM too. We'll talk about him in more detail in a little bit, but I see similarities between Mitch and Bob Bass, honestly, for the same reasons of, you aren't in a large market. You don't have these crazy revenue sources to go spend insane amounts of money and go well into the luxury tax. And so you got to be smart, you got to be methodical, and you got to trust your gut. And I think Mitch Kupchak, to me, I have loved being around him. He's got such an institutional knowledge of the game, and I learn something every time I walk away. And I think that's kind of an old guard in the NBA. I don't know how many guys are left like that. Bob Bass blazed a path like that. I think Mitch is too. So I think that's another kind of interesting thing that seems to align with what San Antonio's done.
Absolutely, and it comes to mind the term lifer, and that's not a disparaging term. These are guys they devoted their life to basketball and the NBA, and with that comes a ton of knowledge. And the Spurs right now, they're trying to hang on to that. I mean, they certainly have it in R.C. Buford and Pop, but they want to hang on to it from a player standpoint, and that's why it's so important to them to try to squeeze one more year out of Manu. What he brings to the table in terms of leadership is just off the charts. And, setting a tone for the younger players. They see this guy, 41, just going all out night in and night out. It's kind of hard to pick your spots or take a night off if you're a younger player. So, that's so important. And you're talking about the smaller markets. You look at what they've done in Utah. I mean, that methodical building, that's very Popovich-like. And, of course, the thing that separated the Spurs from everyone else is that they got so lucky in terms of drafting or winning lotteries with Davidson and Tim Duncan. But you can do it without those great pieces. You just do it methodically, as you pointed out.
I thought it was so funny because I think it was I heard Woj and Bobby Marks talk about this during the summer, talking about the Spurs dynasty and how much we just throw that term around in Spurs culture and all that stuff. And they said ultimately at the end of the day, the Spurs dynasty is Tim Duncan. Because without that, without that cornerstone, but you don't often think of it that, and it's not disparaging to anybody else. But then when Tony wrote his farewell letter to San Antonio in the Players Tribune a few weeks ago, he literally said that explicitly, saying, the Spurs dynasty is Tim Duncan. We all did what we did because of him and his way about him and the way he carried himself and how selfless he was. And then, of course, an incredible basketball player, too. So it's funny how, Tim Duncan was so selfless, but he did not love the attention or the fanfare, any of that stuff. But as time goes on, maybe we're going to keep looking back more and more fondly of that guy deserves a lot of credit for what the Spurs did.
Greatest teammate, or one of the greatest teammates in the history of sports, any league at any time. And, the football analogy that's easy to make is Tom Brady, what he's done for the Patriots and how they've built around him is the same component. And Pop's been very, he never misses an opportunity to credit Duncan for what he's been able to accomplish as a coach. So, yeah, Tony, that was something, because Tony had a great career. I mean, just an outstanding career in San Antonio, and in his own right, he would have been great anywhere. But Duncan certainly made him and everyone else around him better.
Tom, your first reaction when you found out that a 4-time NBA champion, a Finals MVP, 6-time All-Star, 17-year veteran who has spent every year of his NBA career with one team in the San Antonio Spurs was signing with the Charlotte Hornets, your first reaction was what?
Well, it was I'm not surprised, and it was because I know that he wants to have an enhanced and increased role over what the Spurs were anticipating for him to do this year. It's painful to leave San Antonio, and it's going to be so strange for him and for the fans, everyone involved, but he's a competitor. He's a fierce competitor with a lot of pride, and he still thinks he's got a lot of game left, and he just didn't want to be a guy here who had spot duty, or just his job was just to pass the culture on to the younger point guards, younger players. He believes he can still contribute in a significant way. So I was not surprised in terms of that. I'm not so sure if he can do it, though. There's a lot of tread on those tires. I think the mind is certainly willing, but I'm not so sure the body is. Although he started out so strong last year, and then he kind of tailed off. Maybe it's just a case he needs a full year to recover from that devastating quad injury, and he's going to be back to a much stronger, more familiar form this year. It's going to be intriguing to watch.
No, I agree, and I think what's maybe really fascinating is Mitch. People talk about Mitch, he's a great poker player. He is a very good poker player. You've been in this league for over 30 years as an executive. You learned not reveal your hand at all times, but immediately after the draft, after drafting Devontae Graham, who I think is going to be a very good player that we selected in the second round, I think that's going to come back and we're going to look at getting a good rotational player there. He talked about Devontae maybe being ready in the second half of the season and looking for a more veteran ball handling guard, not necessarily a point guard, but a veteran ball handling guard who could also score at times and at times could play with Kemba late in games. And so when you start to think about, even before Tony came into the mix, when you start to think about that, and then you mix in JB coming in here, I mean, that makes sense. And now we're talking, the numbers I think that have been thrown around is, maybe 15 to 20 minutes a game. And I think, so that makes sense, right? That seems to be a better fit in that way.
Yeah, exactly. And with him having a bigger role, carrying a bigger burden early in the season, mid-season, I mean, you're probably going to get the best out of him then. But you can't count Tony out at his age for having a better than average season, because, like I said, he amazed everyone last year bouncing back from that injury. No one expected him to be ready at the start or to come back in December like he did, late November. He amazed everyone, but he worked so darn hard, and like I said, he's got so much pride. He's such a great competitor that I wouldn't be surprised to see him bounce back and have a really strong year in the role that's defined for him by Borrego.
How many guys of his caliber, I mean, I just don't know how much press. I'm sure there is a press. I'm not saying he's the only guy that's done this, but when you've started really all but 14 of over his first 1,100 games in the NBA. It started all but 14 of those. And after the All-Star break this year, he goes to Pop and says, I think it's time for DeJounte, right? I think it's time DeJounte gets into the starting lineup, and I need to take a back seat. I mean, how many guys with his his bona fides do something like that. That still seems so crazy.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a byproduct of what we talked about earlier, the Duncan influence. Tim always placing the team ahead of him, and before Duncan, David Robinson doing the same, taking a back seat to Duncan, and then Duncan taking a back seat to LaMarcus Aldridge when he came on board, and it's hard for Tony not to do that when you have Manu Ginobili at your side, a guy who has come off the bench for so many years when he could have been an all-star as a starter in maybe a different team. So, yeah, it's just how the Spurs are. They just put team goals ahead of themselves, and it's always been that way.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, I think like we talk about what's his impact on Devontae Graham, what's his impact on Malik Monk. Malik was so ecstatic when he found out Tony was coming here. But Kemba was as excited as anybody, and you're talking about a guy that's now been in the league for 7 years. He's now developed into a two-time All-Star, one of the best players at his position in the NBA.
I love watching him play.
Yeah, right. And now he's saying, man, I get to play. He literally told JB, you're telling me I get to play with Tony Parker. So that's the other underrated element, I think, is, Kemba always loves to learn and keep growing. The great ones do. And, man, that's a great resource to have in Tony Parker coming in.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's Tony is good to it, imparting knowledge to younger players. He's got a good communication skills. He's got a good touch. He doesn't lord over those guys. Ginobili's the same way. He told me last year, we talked about his leadership style, and he said so much of it is what you don't say, and just not talking so much to where guys tune you out. And Tony's got that same skill.
Tom, when you came back to the Spurs beat full time, because we'll talk about this later, you were on the Cowboys beat for a long, long time. So you came back to the Spurs beat, and I believe that was the same season JB came back from Orlando. And that doesn't. Well, I've talked to JB about that. That's kind of rare. You don't see a lot of guys leave San Antonio and then come back. And I think there's something there that I don't know what it says, but I think it says something that Pop thinks that highly of a guy like JB to bring him back. And as you know, Pop doesn't hire anybody as a token hire. So
no.
I think that says something. And then, you got to be around him for a few years. So what do you remember back then, even just about, as you said, maybe you didn't interact with him on a daily basis, but just kind of observing what James Borrego was to Popovich at that time and that Spurs staff?
Well, again, just the kind of guy you'd love to have around. For me, just bumping into him anywhere before a game and hearing him say my name and flash a smile and just be friendly, that meant so much. And he's just got that going for him. He's just a good guy to be around. And like you said, that's a great observation, Chris. Pop doesn't make any token hires, and he wants inclusion, he wants feedback, he wants input. And James certainly was at the forefront of that. I mean, he always in the mix, always making suggestions and taking a very proactive role with coaching the team.
Yeah, JB explained it this way to me and some of our season ticket holders, where he said he wants to be challenged. So he specifically built a coaching staff that looks different than him, sounds different than him, talks different than him, thinks different than him, and that's what he wants. He wants different because he thinks that's the way growth is going to happen for this team.
Yeah, pop, and more pop. Yeah, I mean that's straight out of his coaching book, a page out of his coaching book for sure. That it just shows his influence so much.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too because if you look, I mean, it makes perfect sense. You look at our coaching staff right now; he's put together and. Yeah, they're all different backgrounds, all different age groups too. You got a veteran who's been in this league forever, and Jay Triano is the associate head coach. He'll be a great resource for him next to him on the bench. And then you go all the guy like Ronald Norad. Ron played against Kemba in the national championship game with Gordon Hayward at Butler, and now he's one of Kemba's assistant coaches. So that's very Spurs-like, I think, to see just kind of the different backgrounds and skill sets that everybody's going to bring to a bench.
Yeah, and those guys will be great with player development too, with the younger guys. Monk and Bacon, and I know they want to get more out of Kid Gilchrist, and that staff's impressive beginning with James, and I think they're so much on the right track. They're going to be one of the more intriguing teams to watch and just see how things play out for them. And certainly here in San Antonio, we'll keep a close eye on them. I'm headed up to Dallas for the preseason game. I think the Hornets preseason finale is up in Dallas. I'll be going up there to do a piece on Tony, and I look forward to seeing those young guys play as well.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this, and then we'll transition to talk about Bob Bass before we wrap up here. You talk about player development. That is such a buzzword. You've been around that Spurs team, so to them, when they talk about player development, what is that? Because it's not just skill work; it's beyond that, right, Tom? So, like, what is player development, and what are those things that have allowed them to, again, only have one pick in the top 20 over the last 21 years and still be what they are? How does that? What does that look like?
Well, a lot of it is just learning how to be assertive and take charge, whatever your position may be. But immediately, what comes to mind is DeJounte Murray. I mean, that's the development there. They're going to work on his shooting, of course, and other aspects of his game, defense. But they're going to pinpoint. The Spurs will pinpoint what a guy needs the most, and they'll hone in on it. And especially with the point guards, I mean, they're going to teach you to be assertive, to take on a leadership role, and be proactive in that area. And then, of course, they do look at what a player needs to improve at. And with Kawhi Leonard, it was shooting. They worked on that, night in, day out, night in, night out. He got better. They're doing that now with DeJounte Murray. It's just really pouring your resources and your time into improving a player's weakness, and at the same time having them become better at the cornerstone things that the Spurs want: defense, accountability, and leadership.
Tom, you wrote a fantastic piece for the San Antonio Express News, so you can check it out at SpursNation.com too, but about Bob Bass, who passed away.
Thanks, Chris.
It was fantastic, and it was a great tribute to him. And I think he's a guy that, as I grew up around this Hornets team over the years and have been around Charlotte over the years, I feel like he's become a forgotten piece in Hornets history. Mm-hmm. Maybe he's almost, I don't know, you could speak to it in San Antonio after the RC and Pop days, what he was before that to lead into that. But yeah, when I say Bob Bass, what comes to mind to you, Tom?
First and foremost, a passionate love for the game. It was like a drug to him. He had outside interest. He loved to go dove hunting. He loved golf. He loved to go down to the coast. But he always came back to basketball. He couldn't live without it. Starting out as a high school coach in Oklahoma years and years ago. So he just couldn't live without it. And the other thing that comes to mind, Chris, is loyalty. The Spurs were everything to him, making them better, making them relevant, and placing them among the elite was his mission. At the same time, he was a very loyal guy. He didn't always agree with ownership. He had some really heated, passionate arguments with various owners over the year, Angelo Drosas and Red McCombs. But when the decision was finally made, he saluted and he carried out his orders and did it to the best of his ability. He was interesting to be around. He was wound tight, very intense, but at the same time he had that down-home humor, and he could be grandfatherly, a father figure to the players, but then later years a grandfather figure. But he was always wound very tight, very intense, hard worker, and but yeah, the loyalty. In the small market here in San Antonio, early on, he had to balance the budget and watch the nickels and dimes, and he did that. He still managed to make very shrewd personnel decisions, but he also managed to balance the budget and watch the books and do what needed to be done to keep this team from going under in those early years.
Yeah. I would think the ABA day. I mean, Spurs were one of 4 teams at that time. So like the ABA days had to be. I mean, that formed him, right? That probably shaped him, and it probably served him really well once they made the transition to the NBA.
Yeah, the Spurs were a mom and pop organization for so many years, and he headed it. I mean, every aspect of it. When he came to the Spurs, he had he had so much experience at the college level, and then at the pro level, coaching for 3 different ABA teams, including a stint there in Memphis under Charlie Finley. He understood so much about the game, not just basketball, but marketing, contracts, the salary cap. He just had great knowledge in all those areas. He was really just indispensable to this franchise, and you look what he did: 17 winning seasons, in 17 out of 20. They had 17 winning seasons during his 20 years here. They went to the conference finals 3 times, came within a victory of reaching the finals in '79, and then two Hall of Famers in Gervin and Robinson. So if the Spurs had ended in '94, as one of our columnists, Mike Finger, pointed out, you look back at what Bass accomplished and say, man, that guy's he's right up there with the best in the game.
Yeah,
and you know what was neat too for me when I covered him the first go around, other guys in the game, Jerry West in particular, he loved Bob Bass, just loved him and had great respect for him. So that was really neat to see.
Yeah, and you wrote a few things that were in this piece. I don't want to bury everything because people need to check it out themselves, but you talked about David Robinson was one in particular where he had to go do his 2 years of service for the Naval Academy, and people were very adamant he's never going to play for you.
Oh.
So don't waste a pick on this guy. You're going to make a monumental mistake. But Bob was he had strong convictions, and he was certain that, no, David's going to play here, and he's going to love it here. He's going to be a Spur for life. And sure enough, that's what ended up happening.
That was a huge theme back then, Chris, in the national media. I mean, no one's too much. I mean, I'm overstating it, but very few people thought he was going to land in small market San Antonio. The thinking was he would go back in the draft or end up in Boston, Cleveland, with the Bullets, somewhere East Coast or maybe the Lakers, but anywhere but San Antonio. And Bob, well, ownership deserves a lot of credit for that too. They wined and dined him. They showed him what San Antonio had to offer, and then they came up with a great contract for him. But all along, Bob made that a mission to land David Robinson because he knew it would place small market San Antonio among the league's elite.
Yeah, and the George Gervin situation too, where the Iceman's playing the 3. Yeah. And he says, man, this guy's so first of all, they were playing such a slow style of basketball back then. He takes over as coach. They were not good, right? And then he decides, let's speed this thing up and let's move George Gervin to the shooting guard position. And a guy with his skill set at that size, everybody's doing that now, but that was so ahead of the time to move a guy like George Gervin to the 2.
Well, they were competitive, but they certainly weren't a great team or a near great team, and it was just mismatched. You had guys, these thoroughbred great scorers in Keenan, George Gervin, and James Silas that were being asked to be defensive-minded guys first, and it just wasn't their style. And the other thing, Bob recognized that, and he recognized the beating that George would take playing against bigger forwards, and how he would be such a mismatch for guards, smaller guards. Of course, all guards were smaller then, so he made the move. But the other thing about that, Chris, was he also had that eye toward marketing. The Spurs needed an entertaining team in those early years in order to draw fans, and Bob recognized that, and that was a big reason why he made that move, and it certainly paid off in a big way.
So 2 things here on Bass, and then we'll get to wrap up on this. But I think in your piece you had a quote from Red McCombs, former Spurs owner, who said Bob was 99.9% right, and that sounds about right because so it was funny because Rick Bonnell wrote a great story last week about Bob paying him tribute, and then Tom Sorensen had a great column about him the other day in the Observer as well, and they both kind of told both sides of the coin. Where Rick wrote this story about how back in 2001, as irony would have it, the Hornets wanted to select, or at least Bob wanted to select, some point guard named Tony Parker, and then minority owner Ray Wooldridge said, nah, we want this guy Kirk Haston. He's going to be really good instead. And Bob didn't lose a lot of arguments, as you said, but he relented on that when he said, all right, Shin, he's your guy. You let Ray make the pick, and so Ray did. He won out, and obviously the rest is history. But the other side, too, was, and I remember being in the building for this game, Game 6 of the 0-1 Eastern Conference semifinals. Hornets were up 3-2 against the Bucks, very talented Bucks team, and they were up 10 points at halftime and ended up not hanging on to the lead. I believe the game went to overtime, and then they lost Game 7 in Milwaukee, and they didn't go on to play the Sixers in the Eastern Conference Finals. It's the furthest the team ever advanced in the playoffs, and instead of being so crushed about maybe a missed shot or a wasted possession on the team flight, Bob looked out the window aimlessly and said, I just didn't see it. And what he was referring to was Kobe Bryant when he scouted him in 96 and just said, I thought he'd be good. I didn't think he'd be that good. Right. And so 5 years later, instead of being crushed about the moment, but that's Bob, right? He was thinking literally big picture, we wouldn't be in this situation if we had Kobe Bryant right now.
I know, and it probably... probably had sleepless nights. I know how intense Bob was, and he made some mistakes here in San Antonio too. Frederick Hughes was a monumental bust. Dwayne Shinsis, his first-round picks, but he was right on more times than he was wrong. And famously here, Red McCombs is so good about talking about how he made such a huge mistake hiring Jerry Tarkanian, and Bob was just adamant with him. You're making it's going to be bad, but Red, it's going to be real bad, and he was right. Tarkanian was so mismatched as an NBA coach, and Bob recognized that, but Red went ahead with it mainly because he wanted a guy that would, a big name at that time.
Well, let's wrap up with this. You've covered a lot of stuff over the years, Tom, and you were on the Cowboys beat for 15 years?
Yes, and 15 years, and then I also did the triplet years with Aikman and Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin in the early 90s.
Man, you've seen some really high highs on whether it's the Cowboys beat, the Spurs beat. I would wonder for you, as you've kind of seen how things have changed, sports are ever evolving, the NFL's always chugging along, but the NBA feels like it's close to what it was maybe near the end of the 90s when Michael was running the league. It's amazing to watch and see how healthy the league is right now. What are the differences? I don't know, maybe some of the different challenges versus an NFL beat versus an NBA beat, and what do you think of where the league is right now? Well,
the biggest challenge right now at this stage for me is just the travel. I mean, in the NFL, you got that one game a week. You have a rhythm to building up to that game, certain stories that you do. The travel is just so much more manageable. It's a grind. It's a challenge in the NBA. You've really got to take care of yourself as a writer, as a beat writer, and try to get your rest where you can. But the league, it's just outstanding right now. Great leadership at the top from the commissioner's office. Some really, really great coaches, fun coaches to talk to, and same with the players. I mean, I don't have that opportunity in the NFL all that much to sit down on the road, like I do in the NBA one-on-one with a guy like Manu or Rudy Gay, and just to have them be so accommodating and give you such great insight. I took this trip up to Baltimore this past weekend to do a long takeout on Rudy and how much he's given back to the city of Baltimore. And just so accommodating. It was such a refreshing experience to get to know his family and sit down with him and really get a lot of good quotes and good time with him. I didn't get that in the NFL, and just a different animal. So I'm enjoying this. I love football though, and like I said, I love the travel in the NFL. So, but hey, It's been a good experience.
I tell you what, it's funny to me too because as somebody that grew up on the Hornets first and then the Panthers came around, I'm a Panther season ticket holder. I like the NFL a lot. I love the Panthers. I like the NFL. I love the Hornets, and I also love the NBA. I'm somebody that could watch two NBA teams play on any given night for no good reason. So it's just interesting, like being around both when I used to go to Panthers practices and versus being around the Hornets. I just think it's a difference. Like you said, it's a difference in leagues where it's not that people are trying to shut you down in the NFL. Maybe it's just the timing aspect of it. I don't know what it is, but I feel like players, coaches, staff in the NBA, they're willing to kind of let you peek behind the curtain and share their knowledge and information and storytelling with you. And there's something refreshing about that. I don't think you get that in the NFL.
I think you're right. I remember going back to the 90s, one of the best stories I ever did, most enjoyable, was sitting down with Sean Elliott and writing about his experiences growing up with his parents. And both of his parents were very helpful, and Sean was great with that story. Those are the kind you remember, the kind you really enjoy, where you get to know people as human beings, and what shaped them into the people that they are today. And I love doing those stories, and some of my best memories are doing those types of stories with NBA players. Yeah, so, and hey, I'd be remiss without mentioning how much I like going to Charlotte. I've been there many, many times with the Cowboys, and then now with the Spurs, and I always enjoy going to that city. I love to eat, and there's some great places to eat there, and great places to get out and walk or run. So, yeah. Just love Charlotte.
Well, tell you what, I'm a runner, so if you want a running partner when you come into town, just hit me up and we'll go for a run before tip-off. And
sounds good.
And I will say, I'll see you in Dallas since we'll be there for a final preseason game. And since you were kind enough to take about 30 minutes of your time to just talk some NBA and some Spurs and everything with us, dinner's on me. JB claims to be a foodie, so I'll get the recommendation on where we go in Dallas, and then it's my treat. Okay, Tom?
Okay. Well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. It was my pleasure doing this anytime.
Appreciate Tom Orsborn dropping by, beat writer for the San Antonio Spurs for the San Antonio Express News, SpursNation.com, and some good insight into Tony Parker, James Borrego, and, of course, the tie that binds the Spurs and the Hornets together in the now late GM Bob Bass, and we appreciate him doing some storytelling and giving us some insight. You can check out the podcast if you've missed any of the 11 episodes before this one at YouTube on our official Charlotte Hornets YouTube channel. Just search Courtside Seats. You could search my name. You could search Charlotte Hornets and subscribe because we got all sorts of great content that's up there. You can also find us wherever podcasts are available, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and, of course, Apple Podcasts. So same thing. Just search Courtside Seats. You can search my name, Kroeger. Subscribe. You make sure you rate and review and check out all the previous episodes. We'll be back again next week right here, another episode of Courtside Seats.